Hello everybody, good evening. Welcome to Book Club, Tortoise Book Club. I'm Liz Mosley and we are here with, I've been really looking forward to this. Not because I'm going to get a few weeks off from Monday, but particularly because I have been a long-time fan of Stuart Maconie, and to prove it, I've brought with me my well-thumbed and much-loved copy of Pride and Prejudice in Search of the North. Stuart Maconie, who you will all know, is described on the front of this by Peter Kay as the best thing to come out of Wigan since the A58 to Bolton. And for those of us who've been to Wigan, that could well be true. He's talking to us today about his most recent book, which is called The Nanny State Made Me, which I finished this afternoon, and it is an absolutely brilliant read. It did make me cry, it made me cheer, moving, sad, angry in parts, funny in others, and I'm thrilled that Stuart is with us. As always, at Book Club, there'll be me, there'll be Stuart, he'll do a bit of reading, but we want to hear from you as well. So stick your digital hand up if you would like to. You can find it in the participants button. Join in the chat. Ellie Jacobs is on the chat, and just weigh in with what you'd like to talk about in praise of the welfare state. In the world we're living in at the moment, these kinds of issues have taken on a whole new complexion, even from when the book was written, finished just before Christmas, I think. So hello, Stuart.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. Do you want to kick off by reading a bit out of the beginning of The Nanny State Made Me? Because I think that's as good a way as any to set the scene.
Let me read you the introduction then, which kind of gives you a flavour of what the book's about. It's not, it doesn't go into the kind of detail about stuff, to use a technical term that the rest of the book does, but it'll give you a bit of a flavour, and it's kind of worth, things like this are what gave me, incidents like the one I described here, sort of what gave me the idea. London's skyline bristles with towers, old and new, bloody and sleek, sandstone and silicon, monuments to kings and to commerce, from the Amazonian giants of the city's money jungle to the high-rise canyons of Camden. Visitor and native alike marvel at them, orient by them, lifting eyes from book or phone or feet as the train exhales into Euston, as the bus crests Muswell Hill, as you jostle through the West End. Whenever I pace the narrow lanes of Bloomsbury and Fitzrovia, I look up for one in particular, a Grade 2 listed building, much more familiar and human in its dimensions than the boastful monoliths of Canary Wharf. It's had many names and many lovers. It looms over works by Ian McEwan, The Goodies, and Alan Moore. It's part of our shared national iconography, surely a symbol of something, glamour, vision, adventure, the white-hot future that was coming. Early in the 21st century, around about the time that we realised that that particular future wasn't coming, actually, for most of us down below, I had lunch at the top of that tower in the restaurant that used to revolve, the restaurant of failed dreams, with the man who helped to build it. I was filming an interview with Tony Benn, the grand old firebrand of the Labour movement, about the building's history. In 1966, along with holiday camp magnate Billy Butlin, as Postmaster General, he opened what was then called the GPO, or General Post Office Tower, a new and thrilling addition to the London skyline, commissioned by the state, designed by civil servants, the draftsmen and architects of the Ministry of Public Buildings. Neither of those positions or organisations exist now. When a new Britain began to emerge at the end of the 1970s, as one of the first of what would become countless privatisations, the GPO Tower became firstly the Post Office Tower, then the Telecom Tower, and finally the BT Tower. As Tony Benn and I sat talking in the quiet restaurant, closed to the public for decades, on the vague and spurious grounds of it being a terrorist target, I could sense the mounting anxiety of the slick and besuited PR man lurking nearby. Eventually, he sidled over to our table. "Stuart, Tony, hi. I can't help noticing, guys, that you're referring to the building as the GPO Tower." He laughed nervously. "It's not been that for a long, long time, guys. Can I just remind you, it's the BT Tower, as in British Telecom, who own it." Ben fixed him with a stare that combined pity and scorn. Excuse me, I won't do an impression, by the way, Tony. I oversaw the opening of this building. It was built using British labour and skills with the money of the British people who paid for it with their taxes. It belongs to them, and it always will. Margaret Thatcher took it from them and gave it to you when it was not hers to give. This isn't your building, it's theirs. And he pointed to the streets below and the busy, swarming, preoccupied workers. And it was stolen from them. The PR man, wilting and tasting defeat, moved silently back into the shadows. Ben turned to me, rolled his eyes, and winked. At that point, the seed of this book was planted. What happened to the GPO Tower was the start of a story, and this is it. This is my story, your story, and how it was stolen from us.
Thank you so much. The sort of, there are a few characters that crop up in the book, and the marketing guy / PR guy, it sort of looms a bit because so much of it is the through line about privatization, really, and the where a commercial businessman mindset or reality, actually, there's a lot of real businessmen that come in for a bit of a walloping as well as the characters. It's a highly personal but very political book as well. Stuart, how long were you working on it?
Well, quite longer than most of my books, actually, because I usually reckon on a book taking me about maybe 8 months to a year to research, because normally my books involve quite a lot of research. Yeah. Although the one before this, actually, in a very neat trick, I managed to get all the research done pretty much in one fell swoop, because it was a rewalking of the Jarrow March of 1936, when the unemployed Jarrow men marched to London to deliver a petition. So the bulk of that was done in the 3 weeks it took me to walk. But generally, about 8 months to a year of research, and then about 6 months to a year of writing. But this took a little longer, simply because, I don't know, I mean, you know, my publishers said, you know, as the deadline was approaching, they said, Lord, make it, you know, give yourself another 6 months, do it properly, go do it some other places. But my books fall into two quite distinct phases. There's research, taking notes, all that, and then there's a period of where in a room like this, probably this very room, bashing away at the typewriter, or typewriter, the laptop. But the idea had percolated for a while, and I'd spoken to my publishers, because my books have been for the last few years mildly, vaguely politically with a small p. But I had this idea, and we ummed and ahed about, because I wanted to take my readers, those people who loyally buy my books, which is great. I didn't want to suddenly jump from the kind of books I do, which I hope are quite funny and readable, to a dry, kind of polemical text of the kind that, no offense, but the kind that, you know, a lot of people do, you know, there's been a lot of it. There's been a real resurgence, quite rightly, in political writing over the last few years. And there's been quite a few quite polemical, quite angry and justifiably angry polemical books about all kinds of things, from race to class to government. But I thought, well, I don't want to, that's really not me. And I didn't want to suddenly land that on my readers. So I wanted it to be this weird, and I think it is a kind of weird hybrid of a personal journey through my life and backstory. It's got interviews in with my friends and people I've found who have got similar stories or interesting things to say. It's a bit of a travelogue, but at the heart of it is this kind of polemic, which is backed up, I hope, by research about what I think has been the catastrophic post-1979 trend towards the privatisation of British life.
It very much is, like you say, that hybrid. It's also really strong on character, and I know that comes from you've been out and you've interviewed people, but you discover things that you just wouldn't know about, and then you discover things through the people, things that you know about. You know that a matron who works in a big hospital is a brave and brilliant woman, and then you go and meet Julie, and there's another Julie in the amazing library, and somehow through them the whole thing becomes it's a personal story, you know, small stories that cast a long national shadow, and that's the way it comes. Just tell us about some of the people you met along the way, because that's really where it becomes very moving, I think.
Well, there are two kinds of person in the book: what you might call vaguely famous people who are friends of mine, or who I wanted to have because they had funny and entertaining things to say about some subjects. I'll come back to those in a minute, maybe. But then I went to people like you're talking about Julie Treadgold, who's the matron of the first ever NHS hospital, which is Trafford General in Manchester, opened by Nye Bevan in 1948. And, they are very proud of that. And she's incredibly proud of it still. And she took me around and showed it me. And she showed me the spade that dug the first bit of the foundations and things like that. I went to Shetland to interview a terrific lady called Susan Bowie, Dr. Susan Bowie, who is pretty much Britain's most northerly GP. And she has a practice right up in the North Maven of Shetland, the most northerly health centre in Britain, in this incredibly remote and beautiful place. She talks about, well, I've interviewed her in her office, which overlooks this incredible bay in Shetland. And sometimes the reason for that was, sometimes it was sheer convenience. I happened to have a contact with these people, but other times it was, for instance, that I think in that case, people often will say about remote communities, isolated communities, they don't need the state, the apparatus of the state, rugged individuals living their own lives. And in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, she's a GP, she's there as the NHS. Yeah. Yes, community spirit and voluntarism, if that's a word, matter a lot there. But so does the library, so does the health centre, so does all these things. And I wanted to say that no one is an island really. And Caitlin Moran says in one of the other interviews about the welfare state, and my book's not just about the welfare state, it's about the whole civic realm of, not just benefits and social housing, but it's about libraries and swimming pools and golf courses as well, the municipal realm. And she says in the book, the welfare state is love made institutional. And I absolutely think that's a great epigraph for the book, because that's really what the book is about. In the, I just felt we've been fed this. Well, the idea was it was reclaiming the phrase, like people, like all kinds of people have tried to reclaim all kinds of phrases from recently or in recent decades, from queer or whatever, to people say, no, I want to reclaim that phrase as something that is something to be proud of. I couldn't believe that people said nanny state all the time so disparagingly. And I came up with this phrase: the people who complain about the nanny state are the people who have nannies. Because, but what was slightly horrifying was that so many people like me who'd never had a nanny in their life use this phrase. I mean, we wouldn't have referred to the chauffeur state or the butler state. No. And yet we use this phrase that men like Jacob Rees-Mogg use, who has had a nanny, still has a nanny.
Still has it.
Yeah, still has the nanny. He crops up quite a lot in the book called Jacob, who's disappeared from British public life. Have you noticed that?
Where's he gone?
Anyway, where's he gone?
Observing the rules of lockdown, dutifully.
Well, it's almost as if someone at Tory Central Office regards him as someone who would have said something stupid that would have put the nation's back up. Isn't it? It's almost as if he's a loose cannon, not to be trusted at these delicate times. Anyway, but I just thought it just horrified me a bit that we trot this phrase out. Even people, working class people, trot it out. Oh, nanny state.
Yeah.
What are governments for, if not to look after their citizens? The book also, I must say this, is, I know I'm diving around the topics here, but I do say in an early part of the book, which is called A Short Love Letter to Capitalism, I say that I do not want the government to make my shoes or my pop music or my curries. I'm happy to leave that to gifted, talented, entrepreneurial people. But I don't think people who do that should run the prisons and control the water supply. I think some things are too important to be left to Richard Branson and Alan Sugar and Philip Green. Well, pretty much everything's too important to be left to Philip Green. But I mean, you know what I mean? I think I have no problem if you want to be an entrepreneurial type and make some great clothes or some great bikes or some great cars or whatever, but I don't think you should run the prisons.
Yeah. It's full of, and the reason I asked about how long it takes to put together is because the book is, it's entertaining and it's a page turner, but it's dense, it's full of fact stuff. Yeah. Stuff that I didn't know before, and little things I didn't know before, and really big meaty things I didn't know before. Some of them just to give people a sense of it. I didn't know that Margaret Thatcher opened Keighley Library. I grew up near Keighley. My mum told us when we were growing up that going to Keighley Library was a day out, and I believed her for years. So I didn't know Margaret Thatcher opened Keighley Library. I didn't know St Jude was the patron saint of lost causes. I didn't know the mental and physical health benefits of parks save the NHS £111 million a year.
Yes.
I didn't know about the sexism in the Beveridge report. Not that that makes it not a good thing, but there's tons of stuff that it's a sort of a history book for people my age about stuff that I noticed and was there for. And it's sort of weirdly, it's incredibly satisfying, nourishing because of that. It's sort of very generous in the detail. It must have been hard to make it not boring.
Well, that was the thing. I worried a lot about this, and I think I've had a couple of sniffy reviews. Very interesting. One person I had a review was quite sniffy. Basically, I think saying, "Who does this fellow think he is, writing a book about social policy and history?" That's my patch. But I think that's because people think my hero writing-wise, absolute hero writing-wise, is the late brilliant Clive James. And I think he used to get some of this as well, that he was a brilliant man who could just, who could chat to you at the drop of a hat about 20th century Italian poetry, the Third Reich, the classics. But he also loved pop and jazz and TV. And I think people often mistrust the common touch. People often mistrust the light touch. And they think, unless if you're funny or entertaining, then you can't be serious. There can't be any seriousness to it at all. Well, the British are particularly bad at that, I think. I think we will, if something's dull, we tend to think that it's worthy. Yeah. Which I don't share that at all. So I was quite happy that this book, which should have a lot of factual analysis in it, I hope, like you've just mentioned, but also have me going to places and meeting people and sharing some, funny stuff as well. Yeah, we're very suspicious of anyone who wears learning lightly, I think.
Yeah, agree. I'm going to go to Sally Young, who's a regular contributor.
Hi, Sally.
To ThinkIn's. Are you there, Sally? Hiya, Sally. Nice to see you. Can we hear you?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm also a northerner, but a different part of the north, which is Newcastle upon Tyne.
Proper northerner.
Proper northerner, though posh Geordie, as my partner keeps saying to me. So given when you wrote the book, and given what we're thinking now about the state and how all of a sudden the state has become incredibly important to people, there's something about capturing the zeitgeist, and it's a bit of an unfair question. So if you had actually written the book next year, what would be different?
That's a really good question. And two things to say about that. Very early on in this current crisis, I tweeted, because this happened, my book came out in the first week in March. So it just about came, I don't know if this is a good thing or bad thing, it just about came out before lockdown happened. And so consequently, most of the promo for it was abandoned. But that's, that's fine. That's little. That's compared to what some people have been doing, that's nothing. But I did put on Twitter something to the effect of, when I wrote the book and we picked now to publish the book, I never imagined that the entire universe would get behind the PR campaign by, basically delivering us a global crisis that shows up exactly what this book's about. Because suddenly, there are so many things in it that are quite prophetic. I can't claim any knowledge of prophecy, but like the book ends with a big riff about Eyam in Derbyshire, where I talk about how, the selfness, I don't know if people don't know the story, it's a quite famous story. The people of Eyam in Derbyshire during the Black Death, during the plague, not the Black Death, during the Great Plague, isolated themselves in order to save the surrounding villages. The rector, the parish priest said, we need to isolate ourselves, we will suffer and die. And most of them did, but they prevented the spread. And it was an incredibly selfless act. And I talk about, will we do that anymore in a modern atomized world? And it's incredible that, that exactly that scenario is not quite as severe as that, but exactly that scenario about isolation from a disease happened within a few weeks. So to probably answer your question, the benefit I've got, I guess, is this is the hardback version of the book that's sent out, the audio book and the Kindle and the hardback. There will be a paperback available probably around about the end of the year or early next year. And I've already chatted to my publisher and said, look, usually what happens with the paperback is you fix the typos, you know what I mean? You fix any factual errors that someone's written to you about, or you get me spot the typos. But in this, I've said, look, I think we should substantially, I should substantially go through the book and write a whole new final chapter in the wake of this. So I think that's what happened. So yes, it would have been different. I think if anything, the events of the last few months have showed up really exactly what I'm saying in this book, that what is the function of the state? We cannot, not everything. We saw that straight away, didn't we? It completely proved. I said that some things are too important to be left to entrepreneurs, however gifted and talented they are. And we saw that immediately when people like Branson and Philip Green immediately went cap in hand to the government saying, well, can we have some money to bail us out? I mean, and yet at the same time we had people selflessly volunteering to go and deliver food to vulnerable people. I think it just showed up. Look, again, I'm not anti-business, but I think we've made them into these, our TV is full of what I call capitalism soft porn. Things like Dragon's Den and The Apprentice. For years, we've said these are the most admirable people in our society. They're not. They're just one group of people in society. Maybe we'll start having more programs about nurses and bin men next. That'd be useful, you know.
Yeah, certainly be a change. Barbara's asked a good question. I'm going to come to Barbara in a sec, but there's one particular bit of the book it sort of made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I'm going to read one sentence and then I'll come to Stuart to talk about it. It's about school, it's about education. He's talking about Alan Bennett. So what Bennett is getting at is what everyone who has no vested interest in maintaining the current rotten and unfair system knows. The most direct and effective way of changing Britain for the better permanently would be the immediate abolition of the private schools. And you go on, I think it's in the same paragraph, basically abolishing private schools is equivalent to abolishing slavery and its impact of unfairness and just in one fell swoop. I mean, you know, don't pull your punches, Stuart. Come out and say it like it is.
That was one of the hardest paragraphs to write in the book, and it's one of the toughest written in the whole book, because basically when I wrote that, I was aware of good friends of mine, some of whom, one or two of whom are interviewed in the book, who, for whatever reason, send their kids to private schools. And I don't doubt for a minute that there might even be people here now watching who have experience with private schools, who maybe send kids to private schools or whatever. So I wanted to make this very clear that it was not in the nature of any kind of personal diatribe. I also know that why people send children to private school is very nuanced culturally. For instance, I think that Rishi Sunak's experience of private school and why his parents sent him is very different from Boris Johnson's.
Yeah.
I think that this is a very important point to be noted, I think. Rishi Sunak, in common with a lot of immigrants to this country, that was a way, and I can completely understand this, of making some kind of entry into a citadel that was barred to them. I know from speaking to friends of mine who are second generation Pakistani in Indian, have said, my mum and dad sent me there because they felt that it was a way to get on in British society that would have been denied to me otherwise. Get a good education and do it this way. And I can totally understand that. I think Rishi Sunak's experience, which is essentially his, is very different from Boris Johnson, which is purely about, we do this because this is how our class perpetuates itself and continues to hold the levers of power. Yeah. So I think they're very different. One's an outsider and one is an insider. But my point is that you will never have a fair society in Britain while some people can pay for their children to have access to positions of power and influence.
Yeah.
It's not to do with what you're told. It's not to do with the biology. It's not to do with learning about biology or chemistry or the teaching, because that's not why the power gets conferred. Boris Johnson isn't that smart a cookie, and neither are most of the privately educated members of his cabinet. But what they have got is access to a network of power and connections that education system gets you. And that, it's staring you in the face, as Alan Bennett says. It's just not fair.
The unfairness of what's happening. I mean, the unfairness was known before the pandemic happened, and now we're in the pandemic and everyone's looking at each other going, oh, this doesn't seem very fair. You know, we've happily moved on from is it going to be a great leveler thing? That was killed pretty quickly. I just wonder, let's go to Barbara, because her question talks about the possibility of change and what have you. Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
I like the comment you made in the chat. You've got a question.
Yeah, okay. I can't decide whether this is either a really obvious question or it's too soon to ask you, Stuart. But My question was really whether you think the current crisis might actually make us more likely to value the things that have come from the state, and to recognise them, or do you think it's just too early to say, perhaps?
It's a good question. It's a good question. Thank you, Barbara. I think that there's a little bit of romanticised thinking at the moment. I had a conversation with a friend of mine this afternoon about this, my boss actually at Six Music, who said he felt that a lot of people were saying, oh, we'll never go back to the old bad ways. We're all going to be kinder. The world's going to be cleaner and healthier. And he says, it's not. Within 3 months, we'll have forgotten all about it. I don't share that pessimism. Neither do I share this idea that there's a kind of utopian world about to emerge from this. But I think there are some small practical changes that will happen that I think are still important. I think people will not be schlepping around for meetings they don't need to go to anymore. People will work like this when they can. I think people have seen that the idea of, I'm going off, I'm going, someone in Nottingham saying, I'm going to London to a meeting, and people go, why? I mean, I remember Julian Cope once saying to me, the great Julian Cope, he once said, in our society, when someone says, I'm going to San Francisco for work next week, people go, wow, that's cool. He said, I think we'll arrive at society, and I want the day to come when you say that, someone goes, what on earth for? What a wasteful, profligate thing to do. And I think we are slowly, I think, particularly amongst younger people, moving incrementally towards that sort of society. I don't think young people anymore think all that rubbish about cars and planes is sexy and attractive. So I think that small things like that. So I do think people might work differently, and I think people might travel differently. I do think genuinely that you're not going to hear people I don't think you'll hear people carping on about Nanny State. I don't think you'll hear people moaning about Nanny State and the bloated state and the dinosaurs of the state. I don't think you'll hear much of that for a few years.
Yeah.
I think that will pass out of the political discourse. I just think some interesting people, Dominic Cummings, rather like Jacob Rees-Mogg, where's he gone? I think some of those ideologues of the right, those hard-line ideologues of the right with their anti-state, anti-community, insular, pro-business mentality, I think we'll see a bit less of them for a few years, which will be so pleasant, wouldn't it? It's not, I must say, it's not a partisan book politically, I think. It presents a particular line of thought which could be embraced really by any government, Liberal, Conservative or Labour, the idea that we should cherish the welfare state and the NHS and the public sphere. Now that doesn't belong to the Labour Party. Anyone could own that. The Labour Party turned their back on it for a long time. But I do think that if the Labour Party have got any sense, their next party political broadcast has already been written.
Yeah.
You could show that clip of the Tory party applauding themselves for not giving the nurses a pay rise.
Yeah. Just
show that. Say they wanted you to go out and clap every Thursday for the nurses. Watch this. Here's them cheering each other on, clapping when they turn them down a pay rise. And I would have thought anti-state rhetoric will disappear from our political discourse for quite some time. No one's going to be voting down a nurse's pay rise anytime soon.
Yeah. There's a few comments coming in that I'm going to come maybe to Jason in a sec. We'll just have a bit of a chat about the BBC. I'm going to put a link to an article in the chat, which is an important bit of the book, because it talks about Prescott. Now, you were born in Prescott,
yeah.
Stu, and this is the piece I put in is Peter Goodman's piece in the New York Times, because you talk a lot about it and the response to it.
Great piece, yeah.
Yeah. Just tell us a bit, unpack that a bit for us, because Prescott hasn't done that well since you were born. I'm not saying it's your fault, but
it's been all downhill since then, really. Actually, I must say, Prescott is a fantastic new thing that I didn't know happening in Prescott. They're going to build basically an extension of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre outside London in Prescott, and it's taking shape now. The great Frank Cottrell Boyce, who some of you will know, who's interviewed in the book, who's a friend of mine, who is a fantastic writer and just a general force for good in the world. He's very involved in this. I didn't know this. Prescott has some historical connection with theatre, that it had a theatre, it's one of the first theatres outside London or something, or formed some kind of trade route of theatrical players or something. That's not very well explained, but I do know they are building in Prescott a big extension of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre outside London, which will be fantastic. I'm very pro. Quite often people say about these things, like when they built the Sage in Newcastle or whatever, people will say, rubbish. You know, they don't need that. People need another recycling facility. Well, you need that as well.
Yeah.
Things like that do work. Things like that. I know from spending a long time living in the Midlands that when Simon Rattle and the CBSO and Symphony Hall regenerated Birmingham culturally, that had a massive knock-on for the city's self-esteem.
Same when they built the West Yorkshire Playhouse in Leeds, it was huge.
Exactly. These things absolutely matter, and it tends to be the powerful and the rich who try to put them down because you know, go to sound like an old-fashioned Marxist, knowledge is power, and some people would rather the plebs were kept in a state of, some people would rather the plebs just watch Love Island all day. I mean, that really does suit a lot of people's ambitions for the way society is ordered. Now, again, that's not being snobby. That's just to say, you know, it's regarded as, you know, was it casting pearls before swine to give the people of Prescott Shakespeare? But I don't think so. But Prescott, has suffered terribly in the last few years. It's the most deprived. Well, there's a few people vying for this unenviable position. I think it has the most percentage of people on benefits of anywhere in the country. It's you know, a chill economic wind has blown through it. And this guy from the New York Times came and wrote, I thought, brilliant. Sometimes you need someone from outside your culture, I think, and outside your country to come and see it for what it is. And basically he said, this is, you know, this place has had some hard knocks because of the fact that our political, from 79 onwards, the revolution happened in 79, it was a revolution. No, we're not going to make things anymore. We're not going to support you anymore. Community means nothing. There is no such thing as society. So basically you can all go hang, and Prescott did. Prescott went to the wolves. It's coming back now a bit. And this guy pointed this out in this brilliant article. And of course, in the way that people do, he got jumped on by a lot of well-meaning people from Prescott who said, oh, he was just having a pop at our time. Well, when this happens, I always talk about George Orwell in Wigan. George, you know, when I wrote, when they decided to open a pub called the Orwell in Wigan, some of the councillors in Wigan said, we shouldn't be glorifying him because he did nothing but badmouth the town. It's like, well, he wasn't writing a tourist brochure, mate. He was trying to show what the people of Wigan were living through in order to change it. I went in that book you just mentioned, Pride and Prejudice. I go to Accrington, which is a similarly benighted Lancashire town that suffered terribly from Thatcherism onwards. And I told it like it was. And I had the civic chamber to me from Accrington going, oh, you didn't mention that we've got a Costa coffee now. And I was like, really? Anyway, but what's hilarious is so much so that the local newspapers went out, the local TV went out and interviewed the Vox Pop people in the street. They read them what I'd said about Accrington, and the ordinary people of Accrington said, yeah, that's about right.
Yeah.
So I think that, so that's a long-winded way of saying that article, I think, people didn't like the fact that it was home truths told by someone who wasn't from Britain. And it's a shameful piece to read. You read it and you are ashamed of what we've done to towns like Prescott.
Yeah, totally. I'm going to go to Jason and then I'm going to come to Avril. Avril's had her little blue hand up for ages. So Jason, if you're there.
Hello.
Hello, you had a question about the BBC.
Yeah, so massive fan of Radcliffe and Maconie on Six Music.
Thank you.
Very glad it's moved to 8 o'clock.
Me too.
I don't have to get up too early. But as a BBC presenter, do you think that COVID-19 crisis has meant that we're going to value the BBC more, and that Johnson and his cronies will stop their attacks on the funding for the BBC and treasure it as much as we all do?
This was one of my initial thoughts. I said this early on. I said, you're not going to hear much BBC bashing from them for a while either, because immediately I have a lot. There's a whole chapter in the book. Well, there's half a chapter in the book about the BBC. There's a chapter about broadcasting, about social media, technology, the internet and broadcasting, in which I am quite critical of the BBC structure and quite critical of its management. That said, I do think when, as we say up north, when it comes to hey lads, hey, when it gets to a crisis, immediately people were turning to the BBC. Because I think they do know whatever its faults and its failings. And I know that of late, there have been an awful lot of people from left and right saying that either the BBC is pinko liberal propaganda for the Labour Party, or alternatively, it's the voice of Johnson and his cronies. Because interesting how both these people... Anyway, I do think that it did show that people felt they could trust the BBC rather more than they could trust the government at first. And that's exactly the way it should be. And you hear some of these people, I've heard some of these people recently carping on about the BBC should be more positive and a bit more upbeat. Well, I can see that. Sometimes I wonder, what is the point of telling us the death rate every day? You know, I did, you know, the slightly, I felt exploitative tone of some of the gloominess of the stories. But having said that, I also do think people said you should be more positive and give Boris a chance, you know, and talk him up for all the good things he's doing. Well, I couldn't agree less with that. That's not the BBC's job. You know what I mean? This is an argument that Churchill said exactly the same thing about the BBC during the Second World War, and the BBC stood its ground. It's neither there to talk up the government, not to lambast it at every turn. But I think you will hear less anti-BBC talk for a while. Yeah, in the same way I think you'll hear less anti-state talk in general, because rightly or wrongly, people equate the BBC with the state. It's not quite like that. It isn't a state broadcaster. You don't have to buy your TV license, you know. But for some people, the two are vaguely synonymous, and I can understand why. So I think in the same way that the state won't be subject to as much criticism, I think neither will the BBC.
It's maybe the nanny of the nanny state is related to the auntie of the anti-B, but maybe those two women
isn't that interesting though?
Together. There's definitely a section of language.
Familial terms, auntie, and it's all these kind of things. No, it is that kind of thing, which is both affectionate and slightly, oh, leave us alone, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Let's go to Avril Moore, who sat there sorrowfully with your little blue hand up for ages. Avril, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Yes, Stuart, lovely to speak to you. I was just wondering if you think the size now of the state that has been necessary to come, it's completely anathema to a Tory government, you know, to be as involved in everything as they are. Do you think that after this they're going to be able to resist going back to their kind of small state, you know, however much the public might want this to carry on? You know, is it just something that means that they just cannot ideologically continue with it? You know, financially we're going to have to pay somehow.
Yeah, I just thought it was, you know, I think you're very right. A point I think to me is that as much as I personally am not a fan of his, I don't think Boris Johnson is cut at all from the same political cloth as your Margaret Thatcher's and your Keith Joseph's back then. And I don't think that his government now is. I'm tempted to say Boris's government, sorry, I hate that thing, that familiarising himself as Boris. Boris Johnson's government stand for nothing, really. And some could say in a way that's a good thing, because Margaret Thatcher's party definitely did stand for something. It was very ideologically driven. It was small state. It was cut back the state. It was take on trade unions and destroy them. It was basically destroy the power of the working class in this country, hive off everything to our friends in the private industry. They had a very strong ideological bent that they'd taken from these books by Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and all these people who are out about in the book. By contrast, I don't think Boris Johnson's an ideologue at all. I think he has a vague sense that this is a fun thing to do for a while, which is in some way a good thing and in some way a bad thing. In some way, it's a terrible indictment. I mean, I know some people say, well, we'd rather have a government who stood for something. I'm not sure. But I do think that there is no small state, aggressively monetarist, ideological drive about the current Conservative Party, leading on from really Cameron and Osborne, who were socially liberal, you know, about things like gay marriage and stuff like that, and drugs, obs. I think they are socially liberal, economically quite liberal. So I don't think they will go back, because I don't think they were very much in that direction to begin with, to be honest. And after this, no, I think you might well see the weird, you might well get, is it called red Tory? I think some will call it red Toryism, don't they? You may well see this kind of red Toryism, which is a Conservative Party who in many of their policies actually quite centrist. I think that will have to be the case for a few years.
Cool, thank you, Stuart. Thanks, Avril. I'm going to ask now about character. It's an old-fashioned thing. I said at the beginning, I'm from Yorkshire. My mum was obsessed with characters. She used to say, prize things like grit and gumption, and these are the sorts of, and there's a lot of grit and gumption in some of the people that you meet out and about in the book. And actually, you mentioned Frank Cottrell Boyce a minute ago, and I love the quote that you put in there of when he was trying to describe why was it that everybody liked Gareth Southgate when Gareth Southgate was put in charge of the football, and he said, well, essentially it's about him not being a wanker, which I think it kind of captures it at the nub of it. And you talk in that bit as well about individuality being overrated. Could you just talk a bit about what is it that makes a good character, because those are the people that are missing from the government, in my view.
Frank's got a great phrase. Frank said in it that what he said was, he said he felt around him these days there was a hunger for decency. Now I think that I might say Frank was being a bit optimistic a few years ago, because when he saw that horrible post-Brexit Britain we had, that's interesting as well. What happened to Brexit? I miss Brexit, don't you? That bitter, riven country that we had, maybe this will do something to heal those wounds. I don't know. I could be being a bit hippie-ish and romantic about this, but maybe people will start to realise that we have more in common than we have apart. At least most of us. At least most of us do. And I think that gets onto that riff at the end of the book that you're talking about of mine about individualism is. I think over the last few years, particularly on the left, there has been a huge trend towards individualism. That is, this has been subject of a lot of debate on the left, I guess, recently. I get called an old-fashioned Attleite centrist dad or whatever, because I believe in that tradition of the post-45 Attlee government, which was about community. There has been a lot of thinking on the left and writing on the left over the last few years, but sometimes it's been about me. It's been about saying, I demand the right to completely unfettered personal liberty and expression of my own opinions. I demand to be able to, and that can be about sexuality. It can be about, and these are no bad things. I'm not saying we should go back. What I'm saying is the focus of the left's thinking has been that this is the paramount goal. The individual self-expression, the right to be who you want to be, is the paramount goal of thinking on the left. I don't think that. I think it's one of them, but I think it goes hand in hand with community spirit as well. Of course, people should be able to be the person they want to be. But sometimes one's personal, unfettered personal liberty, as we're seeing now, has to take a back seat to what's good for the community, whether that's social distancing or not going to the Lake District. Or in extreme cases, that's when you send young men off to fight a war for you, or young women. So I do think that we've gone too far down that way of thinking, I think, a little of late, of saying that completely unfettered personal self-expression is the most important thing in the world. It isn't, I don't think. It's one of them. But there's some quite old-fashioned notions that are starting to get currency again, I think, of late, particularly after this. Things like duty, things like sacrifice, things like the common good. And I think they've been regarded as hopelessly unfashionable and a bit boring recently, but that might change.
What do you think is going to happen with identity politics after the pandemic? It absorbed so much time and energy, so much Twitter was sucked into the void of people fighting, and it felt to me like we were fighting for the right to be separate from one another in our own little boxes. That's exactly right. What do you think will happen to all that now?
I don't think it will go away, and I don't think it should go away. I think that it is perfectly fine and reasonable for people, particularly people. I mean, I guess I am a white man from the United Kingdom. In other words, I belong, well, apart from the class I was born into, I guess I belong to one of the most privileged groups of people on earth, and I'm aware of that. So I'm not going to say to someone who feels excluded from society for whatever reason, excluded from the mainstream society, no, you're not allowed to express your individuality or your lack of mainstreamness, if it were. You must not celebrate yourself. I'm not saying that, but I do think saying that is the paramount goal of particularly progressive thinking on the left, or whatever you want to call it, the liberal man. I think there's something that we might say we need to bring that in as a kind of array of our thinking, that isn't the ultimate goal. That's not the ultimate sacrosanct goal. Sometimes that might have to take its place alongside helping others. Yeah. It's a bit like born again Christianity. One of my objections to born again Christianity, I can't I can't be doing with all that kind of fundamentalist atheism. I'm completely agnostic. One of the reasons I can't be doing with fundamentalist atheists who seem to put a lot of energy into just saying, criticizing people being religious. I know a lot of religious people whose views I do not share, but the good they do in their communities, from food banks to charities, is undoubted. And I sometimes want to say to people like Richard Dawkins, what good do you think you're doing? Okay, fair enough. I'm reminded of the great Jeremy Hardy's quote about Richard Dawkins. I've slightly gone off topic, but he said, I'd like to say to Richard Dawkins, you know what, Richard? You're probably right. There probably is no God. No. In other words, all right, mate. All right, you've said that a lot.
Right down.
You've said that a lot. But my mate, who happens to be religious, is running a food bank while you're just saying this. So it's a bit like that. Born-again Christianity rejected all the notion of good works. Born-again Christianity is a bit like the identity politics of religion, in that all that you have to do in order to be saved is say, I've converted. Now, old-fashioned Christianity, like old-fashioned leftism, you say, that's not enough. You have to do some good in the world. Go out in the world and do some good. Just saying, I'm me, isn't good enough. And I think that it's a comparable thing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I put my head in my hands when I read yesterday that virtual Pride had been cancelled because one of the guys that was organising it had once in the past tweeted support for a pro-Brexit, I don't even know. And then there was a whole bunch of people said, well, if you agree with Brexit, then you can't be. And I was just like, what is happening? People have gone mad.
Yeah. That's the danger of when you say that simply one facet of your personality is automatically a great, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's the danger of saying that, when it says that, one facet of your personality means that you are beyond criticism. Yeah. That's the thing. No, by your works, you shall know them.
Graham Duxbury. Are you there, Graham? You've put a comment in about voluntary and community sector and how that's all going to play out.
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, Stuart. I was interested to hear you pick up on charities, food banks, that kind of stuff. And it's quite a binary conversation so far about the state and business and what the interaction between those two things is. And I just wondered where you're placing voluntary and community sector organisations in this conversation, in this space, given that their primary purpose is to address market failure in many ways, yet many of them have become part of those markets, generating their funding for the delivery of services as part of that kind of what's become an industry in human services. So I just wondered what you think about that kind of grey, fluid area in the middle.
Well, interesting point. I'm not an expert in the voluntary sector. I mean, I think my viewpoint in it is probably fairly general and vague and probably quite widely shared, which is that if people feel motivated to help their fellow citizens, then that is an admirable thing. I wouldn't want to stop that. If those activities are covering areas where the government has failed, then I don't agree with it. I mean, I think food banks are something to be ashamed of. I absolutely think, in the same way I think stepping over someone on the street is something to be ashamed of. And they are relatively recent developments. I hate to say this, but my book takes this view that I do think from 79 onwards, we saw a sea change. In 45, we saw a sea change, and in 79, we saw a sea change. And if you went back to someone from the mid-1970s, that supposedly terrible decade when everything was so bad, according to a lot of people on the right, it's quite bad if you were a major shareholder of Rio Tinto Zinc. If you're a working class 17-year-old with a full grant going to university, with a strong trade union and a decent council house. Anyway, that's a different argument. But I think in the 1970s, if you'd said to someone that Britain could have a food bank and people sleeping on the streets, they would have been astonished. So I do think we've come a long way in the wrong direction. So I totally agree with you. Some of my friends will not do. Some of my friends in bands have often gone into trouble. Paul Heaton of the Beautiful South, for instance, will simply not perform. He's performing some shows as a thank you to NHS workers, but he won't do charity. So they've never done things like Glastonbury, because even things like Glastonbury are a form of charity. They fund charitable, which is very decent of them. But his hardline attitude, I'm not quite this hardline, but his attitude is, well, as the song Flag Day puts it, try shaking your tin in front of the Queen. And I'm not that hardline, but I absolutely agree with the central premise of what you're saying, that charities do, to a degree, some of them anyway, exist to redress market failure. And I think we should regard them as a necessary evil rather than a warm, fuzzy thing to feel lovely about.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Graham, for your question. I'm conscious of time because Stuart's doing a thing on the radio at 7:30, so he's got to skedaddle at 28 minutes past. So I'm going to go to Richard to talk about mixed economies, and then I've got one end question. Richard, are you there? Richard Wormsley. Me and Richard have had quite a lot of chat exchange. Are you there?
Video's off.
Hiya.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I can hear you, Richard, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was way back when I studied economics, and I was kind of heartened to hear you talk about the fact that we live in a mixed economy, because it's something that we don't really talk about anymore. We get slightly obsessed with left and right, and obviously we've pushed more to the extremes in that debate in recent years, particularly. And actually, most people, certainly when they come to elections, are probably somewhere more in that centre ground. So I think one of the things I loved about the book is that it celebrates that in a way that seems to have disappeared from kind of day-to-day discussion about, you know, what actually works, a more pragmatic view rather than an ideological one.
Absolutely. The book unashamedly says from the word go, I'm in favour of a mixed economy, in which free enterprise and private business and state play their parts. And you're right, it's become, but to be fair though, what's happened is that for the last 30 years, we've had the economy has been one-sided to the private sector, to the insanity of saying we should have water owned by, water should be a thing you can make profit from. The prisons should be something you can make profit from. The National Health Service, you know, that to me is insanity. What isn't insanity is that if you've got a great idea for something that you can sell. I mean, do you remember when Mandelson got into terrible trouble for saying the Labour Party are insanely rich? What was he? We're very relaxed about people becoming insanely rich. Now, he got into a lot of trouble with that, and I understand why, but I sort of know what he meant. He was trying to redress that the criticism that's always brought about it. You're trying to drag everyone down. You're trying to. I think what he's trying to say was, no, fine. If you design a better hot dog or you sell more. I mean, you know, Paul McCartney. I have no problem with Paul McCartney being a wealthy man. If anybody's supposed to be a wealthy man, it's Paul McCartney. He should pay his taxes, which he does, and he shouldn't. You know, and his wealth shouldn't be able to buy him or his children, which he hasn't done, access to power and status and influence. But beyond that, I mean, I'm a bit like Mandelson. I'm quite relaxed. Owen Jones said something recently which I thought was absolutely stupid. I mean, a lot of time for Owen, but he said that he felt that there should be a state fast food outlet. Now, that seems to me to be a classic example of solving a problem that doesn't exist, while Greggs exists. As long as there is a Greggs, you do not need a state fast food outlet. Let's be sensible about this. We need proper state control of prisons, water, and hospitals. The pasties, I'm happy to leave to Greggs for a while until the glorious day of the People's Pasty Company comes to pass. But I think that was a classic example of some left-wing thinking, which was to solve a problem that doesn't really exist. You know,
there's a couple of times in the book, it might be more than that, that Stuart writes the phrase, it seems to me to be eminently sensible. It's always like, I don't see what the problem is here. Yeah. This is kind of an obvious thing. So my last question in your last 4 minutes, Stuart, is because the conclusion of the book, the end bit, it's sort of a game of two halves. In that there's a lot to be gloomy about, and I don't know if the paperback edition will be a bit of a rework of it. There's a lot to be gloomy about. But are you hopeful that a sense of national unity can be regained? Because that, even though we're all locked down and we're in theory in it together, it doesn't feel much to me like we really are in it together even now.
I am worried. I'm worried of being. I mean, in half an hour or so, doubtless many of you here will go out and clap, and me too. And I'm worried of. I'm both. That makes me feel both happy and kind of rueful, because I think that we will see. I think we might see some changes. There is the potential. This moment has got the potential for some changes because it's reminded us how fragile we really are and how fragile the bonds of a healthy society are, and that when it comes to a crunch, and I don't think this has been a war footing. I think that's nonsense. Those people who talk about it being the Blitz, but it has had some of the dimensions of a wartime scenario about it. And I think that when you've been in these situations, I think people realise that your individuality and your self-expression and your private profits will only get you so far. But you know, your riches would not save you from this by and large. Well, actually, unless you own Necker Island, I suppose. But so I do think there might be some changes afoot. But on the other hand, I think I'm sure some people on the right are very happy that we're just going out clapping. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, keep the poor saps clapping because we don't want to stick up any pitchforks any day soon. Well, I think clap away, and that's great. But let's also, instead of just feeling good about clapping, let's also feel angry, righteously angry after this about the other stuff, about the people who put nurses down, made them vulnerable, underpaid, unprotected. You know what I mean? So that's the best thing you can do, as well as clapping. The best thing you can do is, have a long memory about this.
Yeah. Thanks, Stuart. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. As I said at the beginning, I've been a bit of a fangirl for a while, so it's been a real pleasure to have you. The book is brilliant. If you have a young person in your life who is a bit not sure about, getting to grips with politics in this country in recent history, I could not recommend a more brilliant way into it, because, as I say, it's highly entertaining and dense with detail and very vivid. It made me homesick. It always makes me homesick reading Stuart's books for the Wharf Valley. So, Stuart, thank you very much for being here. Off you toddle to your radio show.
Thank you very much. It's been really fascinating, really interesting questions. This has been really fascinating, and there will be, when later on in the year, I don't know if anybody's ever seen my shows. I do shows based on my book. I'll be writing one. So I will come to your town, hopefully, and I'll do something kind of funny and interesting about this, sort of when the paperback's out, I imagine. But this has been really interesting, and I'm very flattered that you asked me to do it. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for being here. Thank you very much. And thank you, as always, to everybody, all our Tortoise for coming along and joining in the chat, as always. I've really enjoyed it. Tomorrow, all day for 7 hours, we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence. So heaven knows what that's going to be like. Wow. But go and have a glass of wine and a lie down, because we'll need all your energy for tomorrow if you come into that. Thank you very much. See you later. Bye, everyone.